Dr. Sullivan, I have a question for you. What experiences as your position as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services were you able to draw upon to bring about the vision that you had for the Sullivan Alliance?
Yes, well, first of all, I would say my becoming secretary was a surprise because I was lobbying then Vice President Bush during the campaign very heavily that one of my trustees at Morehouse had been a finalist in 1985 when he was one of 3 finalists but then didn't get the job. Well qualified physician, also experienced in the pharmaceutical industry. And so I called then President-elect Bush the day after the election to congratulate him. I said, I remember we had this discussion about Monroe, who would be a great secretary, etc. Because I had a plan. My plan was with Bush in the White House and my trustee as Secretary of Health and Human Services, I would have access. Well, what happened was, he said, says Lou, I remember we had that discussion, but I was wondering, I'd like to talk with you about that. If you could maybe come up here in Washington in about 2 weeks. So it completely caught me off base and surprised. So all I could say was, okay. Hung up, saying, what the hell was that all about? But when indeed I went up, because I had time to think about this, when he said he'd like for me to serve, and I said, well, it'd be an honor, but these are the things I would really have as a priority. You know, certainly pressing more preventive services. I'm very strongly anti-tobacco, and also very strong on diversity. And his response was, well, I support you in all of those. So during my time there, I appointed the first woman to head National Institutes of Health, Dr. Bernadine Healy, who just died, as many of you know, just about a month ago. We also had our first director of the NIH Institute with Black Dr. Kenneth Olden, head of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. The first minority Surgeon General, Dr. Antonio Novello, Hispanic, and first woman Surgeon General appointed. So, first black to head Social Security, Gwendolyn King. In other words, I worked to increase diversity. Then it was very upfront about that, and I support, and the president supported me on that. Also, very strong against tobacco. I don't think any of you are old enough to remember this, but in 1990, I launched a strong criticism against R.J. Reynolds for a cigarette they were trying to produce test market in Philadelphia called Uptown, non-filtered, high tar, high nicotine cigarette, clearly aimed at the black community, a mentholated cigarette, because as you may know, about 80% of the cigarettes smoked by African Americans are mentholated, as opposed to around 27% whites smoking mentholated cigarettes. So I was very anti-tobacco in an administration where a number of the White House aides had worked for Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, etc. But we did that. Also, we launched the Minority Male Initiative because we have a real problem in that minority females are doing a lot better than minority males in terms of going to college. At Morehouse, for example, 2/3 of our students are women. And as you look at this, you say, well, gosh, if this is a general issue, which it is, then our students, graduates, females, going to really have trouble finding a compatible mate. So we need to do a lot more there. So we worked on programs like that when I was the secretary. And we worked to develop a new food label. Because again, with the great talk that Laura gave here about what's happened in that community in Minnesota, so many of the problems we have now we're trying to address really are related to health behavior. But we wanted a new food label because the previous food label really didn't say anything to anyone. It didn't mean anything. They didn't know how to interpret it. Whereas the food label that we were successful in introducing told people what was a normal caloric requirement or expectation for men and women, and what amount of calories or vitamins or salt or what have you would be in it. So there were programs like that that we administered. The biggest, I had two negative experiences, I would say. One was the AIDS panic. we wanted to really form a good relationship with the AIDS activist organizations, but they didn't trust us. And because they felt that President Bush, of course, had been vice president under Reagan, and the Reagan administration was not viewed as being very interested or sympathetic towards the AIDS problem. I wanted to change that, but I went out to the International AIDS Conference in San Francisco and did not receive, and took a message said, in effect, we want to work with you and address this problem, but we didn't have credibility, so this wasn't believed. So that was not a happy experience. But though President Bush put $4 billion for AIDS research, treatment, education, and screening in his first budget. The other negative experience was we had a Chilean grape crisis. Now, again, most people don't remember that, but our fruit that we eat during the winter, a lot of that comes from the southern hemisphere, including Chile. A lot of citrus fruits, grapes, etc. There was a Chilean fruit pickers strike underway. And the workers were losing the strike. So the U.S. Embassy in Chile got a call saying there's a load of fruit grapes going on a boat to the U.S. that's been poisoned by cyanide. So what do we do with that? Is this really a hoax or a joke? But we couldn't treat it that way. So we hastily had the CDC develop a test for cyanide in grapes, and then we inspected crate after crate of grapes there in Philadelphia and Miami, New Orleans, and other ports of entry. And we never found anything significant. But because of our announcement that people should not eat grapes, I was sued by the Chilean Fruit Growers Association for $300 million. Well, of course, as secretary, I was not personally liable, but in essence, we destroyed the market for Chilean grapes that year. So that was not a pleasant experience. By and large, it was a very interesting time.
Hey, thank you so much for coming to speak today. My question to you is more so kind of for everyone, just in general. I'm a second-year medical student here at DNU, and one of my concerns, not only at this medical school, but at education institutions nationwide, worldwide, is that people don't see themselves in the profession that they may be interested in. So people may be, whether it's an ethnic minority or minority of any other sense, they don't see someone in their shoes who's educated. And I think half of the battle is really getting minorities into these institutions, such as I think you were talking about today. But I think the other half is, what are we doing? What can we do to educate people who may not be of a minority status on these issues? Because I think some of the biggest things is it's not just recruiting more individuals, but it's really changing the culture so that people in institutions, so that here at DNU and in other medical colleges and universities are being educated on topics that are pertinent. So if you could just give us a piece of information on what you think is in the future, what plans can have, so that way when you're doing accreditation, hopefully it's not just for that, but how can you create a culture of acceptance, a culture of educating people on those issues?
I'll respond to that. I think Dr. Sullivan talked about recruiting more minorities to address the issues of diversity, but I think he also mentioned cultural competency. So I think institutions like us, regardless of the numbers, need to be mindful of the fact that all students, regardless of background, ethnicity, should be more culturally competent. So I think we and other academic health centers need to have a committed effort to create an environment that welcomes everyone, but also make sure that the students are here, are comfortable with individuals that are different from their own experiences, so that they themselves know and have an appreciation for differences, and also have a good understanding of what those issues are for those individuals that might be different, that can have an impact on their health care. So curricular issues will be addressed as we go through strategic planning in terms of how we can better infuse issues of cultural competency into the curriculum. So I think a lot of academic health centers are working on just that point. But that is something that we will be talking with the faculty about as well.
I would just add a quick comment. I think it's an excellent question. We as a country, majority or minority, whatever, we have a real problem. Because think about this. After World War II, well, I know that most of you really aren't old enough, but take my word for it, we had a much more optimistic view of the world. We had the GIs coming back from the war. We had all kinds of programs to support them. The NIH really got its real start then, the National Science Foundation, the Marshall Plan to rescue Europe, et cetera. And remember, the burst in new medical schools started in the mid-50s, so that was during that period. Now we have a situation, as I mentioned, where anyone who looks at the manpower issue knows we already have a shortage of manpower. We've had a nursing shortage for 10 years. We've done very little about it. So what I see missing is a national sense of commitment or recognition of need, a national strategy to address that need. We need to do that. We talk about how the Chinese are getting the computer industry and the solar panel industry, et cetera. They're investing. You hear reports of the millions and billions of dollars that are being invested into tomorrow's industries. We need to do the same thing because, as I think my panelists have mentioned, we're in a global economy now. The automobile, we used to be the world's automobile producers. Of course, we lost that. So what we have to do, we have to really rekindle our commitment to science and to future industries. The health industry is one of the growth industries, so clearly that's it. But we have to really not take it for granted. We can't rest on our laurels because the rest of the world will pass us by. So that applies to everyone, whether we're a majority or minority. That I think is a sense of urgency that I don't see. We need to really somehow kindle that sense of urgency.
If I could just interject one point here. One of the things I think that if you're living or from Iowa, you see that we're predominantly a Caucasian population. But one of the things that I see both in our group and around the medical community, certainly in the metropolitan area, is the increased internationalization of specialists coming out. I mean, if I think of some of the recent people who have joined our group, a lot of them have international training and background. So you're going to expand what people are exposed to and what they see and the specialists they see. They aren't all going to be typically what Iowa born and bred. They're people that are coming here to settle and raise their families and have their medical careers. So we've had a significant, and if I look at the hospital systems in town, that's what I'm seeing is that a lot of the people coming out with fellowship and specialty training have been international people who have decided to settle here. So you'll see different people being seen by these providers. It'll just force a difference in who the providers are, exposure-wise.
I think to just piggyback on what Dr. Harug said, if you didn't see the article about how to talk Iowa, did anybody read this? Mm-hmm. Up north, I think it was Mason City. Mm-hmm. And really what they were really trying to do was help people understand who didn't grow up in that area, how physicians need to communicate with Iowans, if you will, about what kind of corn, what kind of corn harvest did you get, what kind of, cows do you raise, and really understand how to communicate in the culture that they become a part of. So I think, that's one leg of the stool. But even as you think about businesses, if people don't understand what's in it for them and they don't have a clue how it might pertain to them, you can talk all day long about a shortage, but somehow I think, really to Dr. Sullivan's point, if you start at the top and you start at the bottom from a grassroots perspective and help people understand how it could impact them, then I think you can get some traction. Otherwise, people will be people and they'll turn their head and they'll forget about it because it has nothing to do with them, or so they think. So I think we can do a better job of that as well. It's a business issue.
So I'm not entirely sure how I want this to be responded to, but something that has been a theme that I think is very important is this idea of community. And kind of the response in what you're talking about after World War II is the sense of community. And what you talked about in Albert Lee is the sense of community and what good they can do in accomplishing all of these goals. And so I just would like, and something that I've seen just in my travels a little bit, not that I'm like old for travel or anything, but is that America has had this very stark turning from that sense of community and individualization, and all that has exacerbated these problems. What is your response to that, and what ideas do you have? I mean, Al Lee's a great example of a system that could do. What can we do? How can we facilitate some more and get people excited about being part of the community and truly supporting each other and getting excited about our collective health care and things like this?
Well, one thing that I often say, health is touched by everything, affected by everything. Among the problems, I think one of the issues that has occurred is we really have had a striking increase in the number of children who are growing up in single-parent families. That has an impact on those children. Not only they're poor because of economic circumstances, but also lack of role models or being in a situation of conflict rather than conciliation. And this is not new, but I say that I had friends and classmates when I was growing up who came from single-parent families who really, in terms of intellectual capability, had as much or more than I had. But they didn't get very far because they didn't have, I was fortunate. I had two parents who worked very hard and worked on me as well as with me, et cetera. That's one thing, because when you're poor, it affects everything, whether your education, your health care, your sense of self-esteem, your ability to have skills, etc. So, and all of that affects your health and vice versa. So I think if we are able to address this, have a stronger sense of community, as you say, so that those unfortunate situations where you have single parents, that we could really find ways to support those families and those children so that they really have a better chance at life in terms of education and becoming useful contributors to our society. That could do a lot. But that's just one thing.
I was just going to add that one thing that I was attracted mostly to Des Moines University about had a lot to do with the community here. Of course, each institution has its own culture, each organization has its own culture, but when you think about trying to change a culture, a lot of it has to come from within in terms of individuals within that culture deciding that there's something unique and distinct about us that needs to be enhanced, changed, or somehow modified. So I think this is a community, Des Moines University, that really values health, wellness, prevention. There are communities out there that don't know what we know. So I think it's important for us as an academic health center, as Des Moines University, given that we believe and have a particular distinct approach to how we see health and wellness, that it's our role as an institution and you as future providers and professionals to make sure that that community spirit of wellness and prevention and the culture that we have here actually goes with you as you go out to serve. So I think there's a way that each of us in our own ways can have an impact to help change culture and change communities. So the whole point of doing this, I think, was to sort of give you some ideas about how as future leaders, you'll have a stake in that. You'll have a responsibility to make sure that happens.
Can I ask, are you from Iowa?
Yes.
Yes. So you know what's been talked about with kind of the death of the small rural town, right? So if you look around Iowa and you look at the number of communities that exist today versus those that existed even 30 years ago, I think the one common theme you'll see is that the towns that have survived had something in common, that was leadership. They had somebody who cared enough about everything else that they were willing to get people to pull together. And those towns that did not survive or that are currently, not even close to thriving today, someone stopped caring about the well-being of that entire community. So it's in the spirit and the theme of what Dr. Franklin said, it really is about making sure we have leaders wherever we go. And it doesn't matter whether that's the smallest town in Iowa or it's the largest metropolitan, city in the country. If you don't have somebody that's willing to try to make a difference, the difference won't happen. I know that seems really, poetic in a way, but I think it's true.
Just to amplify on what Laura said, again with the small towns, if you go to a lot of small towns, the two biggest employers in those communities are usually the school system and often it's the hospital. And as healthcare people who may be going to those rural areas, you're going to be looked upon as a leader in that community. And so it's an important role to fill because people will look up to you as a thought leader or whatever. And often you'll have a higher level of education than some of the people in that community. As a manufacturing thing is kind of gone, amplifying what Dr. Sullivan said, a lot of those jobs are gone for good because we don't have the labor that we can compete that they can do in China and other places. So we have to supplant that with knowledge-based people that have the education to provide service-based sector jobs because those manufacturing jobs are probably not going to come back. You can't compete with Mexico and China on the labor rates that they pay. So you have to find something else to fill that void, and that's why education is such a critical part of what we do from elementary school on up through medical school and beyond.
And I'll put a plug in for Iowa and something that Dr. Sullivan said earlier. So those of you that I hope stay in Iowa to actually practice when you complete your education, the good news is if you're in a small rural community, at least under our reimbursement system, you actually get paid the same for services you provide as primary care that you do in a large city. So we don't actually treat anybody disparately in terms of resources needed to provide care. So you can make a great living in small rural Iowa because our goal is to make sure we prop up the healthcare infrastructure in Iowa. And we feel that will help keep those communities alive.
I probably just ask you because it was talked a lot about the flaws of our healthcare system, one of those being differences in payment for preventative payment versus procedural payment. How can we get other insurance companies on board with well-marked payments as far as level the playing field as far as how you reimburse, I guess?
Good question, because frankly, we're going to have a big fight, because those health professionals who are well paid in the system, they are going to want to give that up. But see, the system we have now, you think about this, we are a capitalistic society, so we say that we reward economically according to the value of the services. Well, I don't accept the premise that what an orthopedist does is more valuable than what a pediatrician does. What a pediatrician does affects that child for the rest of his or her life. It can have a long-range impact a year. But we really did the easy thing when Medicare and Medicaid was set up. It's easy to count setting a fraction or taking out an appendix or a gallbladder, etc. But when you say, well, counseling on vaccinations or nutrition or what have you, that was much too vague, too soft, etc. Well, we can put a value on those, but see, what we did, we put very little value on them. Because, and perhaps we now know a lot more than we knew back in 1965. For example, there have been many studies, as you know, that show that people who exercise regularly live longer, have lower incidence of heart attack, a stroke, they have high blood pressure, diabetes, that's more easily controlled. So in other words, things that really we didn't know then, and many people thought, well, this is just kind of fashionable thing of really no value. We now know that exercise, and also we are much more obese now because of the change in our living styles, they're more sedentary, and the fast foods, etc. So we now have real problems that we have to address in our society because of the epidemic of obesity and the heart disease and the diabetes and cancer and other things that go along with that. So we need to find ways to really not only educate but motivate our citizens to change their lifestyle. I think what Laura has described with the community in Minnesota, I think is fascinating, and that hopefully could be replicated by many other places, because we have to shift from an acute care system to a wellness system. So we have been attuned to fixing things, but it's much better to prevent things And if we're successful with that, it's cheaper and better. We want to keep people healthy so they are working, earning wages, supporting their families, paying taxes, rather than being disabled 2 or 3 months because of some problem. So we have to really find ways to put a value on that and reimburse that. The health reform legislation starts that, so there's something in there for that. But we need to be a lot more rigorous. And some companies have really put in systems, I'm sure Laura knows more about that than I, really rewarding employees for changing health habits, whether it's losing weight or controlling blood pressure, et cetera. Because they've been able to show that the company health expenditures over a year's time are less when you have wellness programs like this than when you don't.
The other thing I would interject here is not just about the behavior driving economic reimbursement. The other thing that happened, because a lot of this is based on policies that come from somewhere. And the other thing that happened when Medicare went in, and that was the payment formulas for the various states. And back then when that was formulated in the mid-'60s, the state that really ended up really ahead of the curve on that was Louisiana. Well, it wasn't based on quality or outcomes. It was really based on the politics of the time. So Iowa ended up on the short end of the stick of that. So while we rank 8th in quality among states for medical care, we're about 49th or 50th, depending on who you look at in terms of Medicare reimbursement. I realize that there's some cost of living adjustments and things that make living in Des Moines a little bit cheaper than living in San Francisco, but there's still a big disparity there. And when we talk about trying to balance things between the proceduralists and the non-proceduralists to have more of a level playing field, it's the same kind of thing in terms of Medicare payment reform. How do you take away from the people that are at the top of the thing to balance it down below? So it's a real political Donnybrook in getting somebody to give that up. Some have said, well, you just make their rate of increase slower, but that may take an inexorable amount of time to even get to the 50th percentile of what some of those places are at. So I think in the overall, if you're going to have true health care reform, those are the things you have to address. And I think the first blush on the patient reform, patient accountability and that sort of thing, that's going to need adjustments and tweaking along the way. This is just the first blush. And the interesting thing about that is that of all the things that, for this is it's a political football and it's getting brickbats back and forth, but the only sector of people who have had a drop in the non-insured are because they expanded the young adult coverage to be covered through age 26. So that's the only sector of our population where there's been a drop in the number that are uninsured. So that's one of the outgrowths that they obviously did something right on that, because there's been a lowering of that population. But it's going to be a work in progress for years to come.
Dr. Solomon, you mentioned in the latter part of your talk about physician and healthcare provider numbers and how the growth of the allopathic profession in the last half of the 20th century was significant, and then probably so has the osteopathic profession. In 1974, there were 5 DO schools. Today there are 31. We've gone from graduating 1,000 students a year to probably 5,000 in the next two or 3 years. That coupled with the growth in the allopathic profession and the non-growth now in graduate medical education due to the Balanced Budget Act, how can we justify continuing to grow the number of graduates from our medical schools while at the same time we have virtually zero growth in our graduate medical education slots?
A good question. I think we have to grow graduate education, and I think it's going to require some innovation. And I think perhaps isopathic schools may be ahead of the allopathic schools there. That is, we're now seeing much more in the way of developing training sites in community clinics and in physicians' offices, et cetera, because in allopathic medicine we've relied to a very great extent on hospital training of our graduates. We need to shift to more primary care training. Again, that's where we need. And one of the things that we found at Morehouse, and Dr. Franklin was certainly part of this, we did arrange elective experiences for our students with physicians working in rural areas Because again, it's hard to tell a student, you train in the city, and then we finish, go practice in the rural community. They don't know anything about it. Well, we felt, well, by giving them some exposure, this might help. Well, interestingly enough, some students came back and said, well, gee, I don't want to have anything to do with that. But others said, gee, that was fascinating. I found this is a great community. I want to be practice in a place like this, etc. And also, many physicians enjoyed having a student there. That they were teaching, but also they were learning. Because, as you know, all of us in academic medicine, we learn as much from our students as we teach them. So I think we have to develop much more diversity in our training sites and use that capacity to expand our graduate medical education.
Just to follow up, as you know, the super committee that's looking at cutting $1.5 trillion out of our budget over the next 5 years has this on their agenda as one area to cut is graduate medical education funding, and the $8 or $9 billion a year that's in the whole scheme of $1.5 trillion is not a lot of money, but to graduate medical education is absolutely critical. And the fact that they're going to probably or consider cutting that, I think, has a lot of people very nervous because we can't lose residency slots, and I don't think residents are going to want to not be paid as the future goes. So I think it's a critical time in our history from the standpoint of GME.
Well, I agree fully with you.
It's interesting that if you look at how, when I mentioned the hospitalist program and how that's changed the face of primary care delivery, we have training programs in the metropolitan area, family practice, pediatrics, internal medicine, that are basically hospital-based programs. And now with hospitalists, some of those pediatricians, primary care, and internal medicine doctors won't be taking care of hospitalized patients. They're going to be taking care of the ambulatory, and the hospitals will be taking care of the ones that are in the institution for care. So the model has to kind of change with what the reality of healthcare delivery is. In some instances, the only one that are doing the full range of care are in the rural areas where they may not have the primary care doctors or the full care providers there.
Again, a big thank you to all the panelists. This has just been a wonderful afternoon. My question is around kind of bridging what Dr. Sullivan is saying with some of the things that are going on in the healthcare system and with reimbursement and the Healthy Estate Initiative. And how do we not leave behind those that are underserved or less affluent in the communities around Iowa? How can those folks participate in becoming healthier? My fear would be that they aren't hooked into the leadership roles or people of influence or affluence. So I'd be interested in any of your thoughts.
So, Ms. Debbie, I'm smiling because if I had seen you in the last couple of weeks, I'd assume you teed me up for that. But since I haven't, you didn't. But interesting question, Pam. So we recently were asked by the governor's office to meet with Jennifer Vermeer, Chuck Palmer at Medicaid to talk exactly about that issue. So if you look at whomever might be, covered under Medicaid or what we would call kind of those folks that are in between, we are very concerned from both a mental health perspective and just access to resources and care and just to understand what could be, there for them. So we are going to meet on a regular basis with Medicaid to figure out how we can do better outreach. So that is a new development on our radar screen. So more to come.
I'd add quickly, we have to, I think, do a number of changes in the system. We need to really empower our mid-level providers to do more than they are currently doing. The fact is, physicians' assistants, nurse practitioners can do a lot of things as well as doctors can do. But because of politics and economics, et cetera, they're not allowed to do it. But I say there's more than enough for everyone to do, and I say that physicians and dentists are not going to be worse off for this. But I'm sure that we all have stories. There's a nurse midwife in Washington, D.C., in the northeastern section of Washington, who is a MacArthur fellow, who's established a birthing program there. And our nation's capital, as you know, is one of the worst cities in terms of high infant mortality rates. She's been able to bring down the infant mortality rates in this poor section of Washington, D.C., striking. But she has an ongoing battle with the obstetricians there. You would think she would be embraced, that they want to work with her, but that's not the case. We have to get away from these turf battles here and think, what do we need to do for the public, and not really have this kind of false battle. And as I mentioned, the interdisciplinary training among health professionals, I think, is a welcome sign. I think that's going to increase. But really, for some of the small communities, we may not have sufficient need for services to have a physician. But if we have a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant there, they can do a lot of things and can really make a real difference in that community.
A question coming back to cultural competency. So you guys are coming from various backgrounds, from various organizations. Can you tell me, how have you seen cultural competency included? What are the different ways that you have seen intermingled in your organization? Because I want to see different trends and what are different ways to achieve that competency.
Well, in terms of the educational piece, cultural competency in the curriculum can have several, different looks. I mean, of course, you can talk about cases, various cases that will be infused into the curriculum, so that there are particular cases designed to reflect, a particular issue of concern, whether it's ethnicity or sexual orientation. All facets of diversity could be incorporated into cases that will be a part of the educational experience. So the curriculum could be addressed. Learning experiences is also another way that, we talked about interprofessional education, but you can also talk about having more diversity within the environment, so that you learn from differences and you learn from each other in a way that perhaps allows for an exchange of ideas that wouldn't happen if you have more of a homogeneous group. So within the academic environment, it can look a number of ways, but the curriculum in particular is something that can be addressed. Faculty, of course, will go along with that, making sure that faculty understand how to infuse those elements into a curriculum and also model the kind of behavior that we think is important for students to learn. So that would be from the academic perspective.
Well, I think inside our own company, I'm proud to say that we had the fortitude and the leadership in our CEO to create what we call the diversity and inclusion approach to the way we do business. And we formed an inclusion council several years ago. That it was done so based on the premise of, we want to create a council just like you have a board of directors, where you have different backgrounds, different focuses, with the understanding that you're still kind of governing for a common goal, and you can be the voice of the employees in the organization. And to think about ways that you can identify where people don't feel included, how do you make sure that starts to happen? And to understand that if we're going to serve our customers, if we don't start to look and act and think like our customers, we won't have customers. So there's a business case to be made as well. And I think that if you talk to several of the employees and did kind of a random sample, I think people would say, because of the constant drumbeat and the recognition and really the notoriety that it gets in the context of everything else we do as a business, because it sits up on top there with equal spotlight, people know we're serious. And it's an expectation of leaders. It's in their competencies and their performance plans. And it's taken very seriously. So kind of going back to one of my tenets, you inspect what you expect. If you expect it and it's not there when you look, somebody's not doing the job. So I think it'd come a long way.
I'd just add a quick thing to this. I mentioned that Dr. Bernadine Healy became the NIH director back in 1990. She set up a women's health program there. And basically, and she's a cardiologist by training, what she was able to show through the Women's Health Research Program was, after menopause, women are equally at risk for deaths from heart attack, stroke, etc. In other words, prior to that time, the impression was that heart attack was a man's thing, etc. So this is one area of cultural competence that has nothing to do with race, but really the assumptions that were made. So I think it means understanding all of the variations that can occur and being comfortable with that. It doesn't mean that the physician has to be of the same race or ethnicity, but has to have some understanding so that he or she can communicate effectively and build trust and with that individual and come out with the right decision. Because like one of my sayings is that the health professions are science-based professions practiced in a social setting. That social setting really is a very important part of that interchange, so we have to really understand that social setting.
I actually have a question. We talked a lot about today about local involvement in communities and also politics at a national level. How, as early medical students and starting in our careers, how do we bridge the gap between the two about being involved locally and a leader in our local environment, but also dealing with, at a national level, changes that are going to affect us? How do we be involved in both of those?
I think the simple answer is, and it's not simple to do, but the simple answer would be to work through your local legislators to really understand what's, what we care about locally and what the focus is, and spend some time. I mean, they work for all of us, so don't underestimate the power of just having a conversation to understand and make that connection.
Just like very large, distinct entities, and sometimes one doesn't necessarily correlate to the other.
Well, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local, so it's really starting at a local level. You can be involved as easy as writing letters. Personal letters have more of an impact than form letters or whatever, but you'll get responses back from people in Washington if you communicate with them. And I think the local people are accessible. When the state legislature is in session, they have, at least in my district out in West Des Moines, they have legislative briefings probably 4 or 5 different times during the session, and I try not to miss those because, number one, the legislators know who you are, and when you send an email, they can put a face with a name, but they know that you're involved and you care and how you feel about an issue. So if you show up at those things, you get them pretty much one-on-one. So, and there are things that you're busy now, and I'm kind of advanced in my life, and I've got time to do that on a Saturday morning, and you guys may be tied up on rounds or looking for that Saturday morning to sleep in. But there are things that you can get involved with early or whatever, and they don't take a great commitment. It takes thinking about it to get involved with it. But you can do that really. You're not going to make a global change at Washington. You're more going to have more of an impact locally, I think, if you do that. And if you get a concerted group of people, you have even more influence, I think.
And it can happen at a personal level, like you going back to your parents and taking a different approach in terms of making sure that the facts speak for themselves. And so as student leaders, educate yourself about what is and what isn't, so that you can be the catalyst for change in your own interactions with family, friends, and others, so that you can challenge the thinking and be willing to stand up to challenge the thinking when it goes counter to what you know to be true.
I was just going to comment that you have 2 senators here who are very active and leaders in health issues. Senator Grassley, of course, over the regulatory activities of the FDA. Senator Harkin over education programs funded by HHS, research programs, etc. And so I think that you should certainly make sure they hear from you. And I repeat what Laura says. Remember, they're working for you. You don't work for them. And I think too many people have it the other way around. They are intimidated by talking to a member of the state legislature or a member of Congress, etc. But you find that most of these individuals are so busy with so many issues, they welcome getting some information and getting a perspective and understanding of that. So I would certainly encourage you to be active with them. I think in most instances you'll find that they'll be receptive, even if they don't do things the way you want. They will appreciate having that information, because there'll be other perspectives that might have them decide something in a different way, but at least they will do that with a better knowledge base from the input that you give them.
We actually have a reception following this Q&A, so to close today, could you all just give us your best piece of advice for developing our leadership skills?
By the way, I saw the dessert table, and you're all going to feel guilty if Laura sees you taking it. So make sure Laura's gone before you grab a cupcake. No, I'm just teasing.
Just leave them with people. It's not a lot.
Okay, I'll start with it. So you just want us to sort of make a final comment. I often talk about the road that I traveled, in my leadership path, and I used to describe it as sort of following this, riding this train from wherever it might take me, because I decided, a particular destination, but along the way, I sort of just took advantage of the opportunities that were there. And sometimes being in the right place at the right time actually advances you. So be open to the possibilities. If there's an opportunity to be a part of something that you wouldn't initially think that you would do, take full advantage of that, because sometimes that might open a door that you wouldn't otherwise have thought that would be open to you. I never imagined doing what I do at the point that I started out on this journey. So remain open to possibilities.
I guess we'll just go down the line here. I think all four of us, when we presented today, and it wasn't meant to belabor or to toot our own horns, but we have a personal biography, and the arc of our careers was important to how we did what we've become. And you're going to write your own history, and you probably don't know what's out in front of you, but I would echo what's been said. You can increase your skill set by a whole different means of opportunities, but maintaining an open mind, an enthusiasm for learning, appreciating different perspectives, they're all opportunities that you can have that will form your career. And then think about that legacy that you want to leave for yourself, that at the end of it, when you're reaching retirement, what mark have I made?
So I would offer, a couple of things. I would say the first thing is to figure out first how to be a really great follower. Because I think if you watch a great leader and you do what you can to make them successful, you start to learn and understand what it means to be a great leader. So being a great follower prepares you very, very well. And I would say the second thing when it comes to leadership is, if you haven't perfected it yet, be exceptionally reflective. So the first time something doesn't go well, if your first inclination is to look outside, stop and learn how to reflect and understand what you could have done differently first before you ask what others could have done differently. And if you learn that as an individual, you'll be amazing as a leader.
I guess my closing comment is this, to say to each of you, when you leave here, you're going to be a leader. You're going to have the opportunity to influence your community, your state, etc. Certainly from dealing personally with the patients you will see, or dealing with an organization or with a political leader, etc. So I think you have to remember that you have really reached a level of potential that most in our society don't have. So what I hope that you do is use that for good. Really change things. And basically, like Dr. Franklin said, that she perhaps didn't know what she was going to do. I didn't start out saying I'm going to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, or I'm going to be head of a... Exactly. But the opportunity, I use the phrase, chance favors a prepared mind. In life, you need to be prepared. Now, maybe you won't get the exact thing that you want, but you get a hell of a lot of things that you wouldn't get if you're not prepared. And there's nothing worse than having an opportunity come along and you're not prepared to take advantage of it. So I think that you have really opportunity for leadership, and I think you'll find if you cultivate that potential, you'll find you'll have a chance to do a lot of things that really in later life you'll be able to reflect on and feel good about. And this means being a good professional, but also being a leader in the community who looks at things where people look to you for your judgment, your experience, and your advice because of what you'll be doing. And I think you ought to be prepared to offer that, so that it means the community will be better off because of your involvement rather than being so narrowly focused that you don't really participate in these community decisions.